But it's now my pleasure to hand over the meeting firstly to Rob McGurk from our Indigenous Committee to remind us about the club's activities and actions in the Donydji homeland. Now, whilst Rob comes up, let's just play a little from the Donydji documentary, which of course was funded with the help of Rotary Club of Melbourne. The full documentary is regularly available on SBS Catch Up, but here's just a taste of it for you.
That's my uncle, Tom Gunnamin, a Rittango man from Arnhem Land, with his friend Neville White. This is their story, but it starts a long way back. Region was my grandmother. The family still lived traditional lives until a mining company drilled into a sacred rock at Donydji. My family had to settle there to protect it. That's when Neville came, in 1974. He came to study genetics, but he was interested in everything, and he's come back every year since then, for the past 40 years.
Right, well, thanks for that, and I hope that that brief clip encourages you to see the movie if you haven't already. If you have, see it again, because you miss a lot in the first time, I can assure you. I've seen it a few times. So the movie, like Don's book, is about Neville and his involvement with the Donydji community in northeast Arnhem Land. So we thought it'd be useful for those, particularly our newer members, to provide you with a background of our club's involvement over 20 years with Neville and the Donydji community. I'll just briefly summarise it. It started in 2003 and it was a joint project with our club, La Trobe University, Neville and the Vietnam Vets, and the Donydji community. It was led by my dear friend and former club member John Mitchell, who many would know, but who has since passed away. He was the driving force of this project for over 13 years. It was originally run through the Welfare of the Young Committee. I'd just like to acknowledge Dave Bryan, who's here, who's one of the vets who went up and worked with Neville for many years, and also Peter Duncan, who was also a member of the committee for many years, who's here, one of my guests as well. The objective of the project was to establish that Indigenous Australians could remain on their traditional homeland and with the right support maintain fully functional lifestyles. The model for this was for us to provide the support and materials for the vets to assist and train the community members to build the infrastructure for the community. And this included a school, a workshop, houses, outdoor kitchens and ablution blocks. Many of the buildings were designed by our club member and architect, David Prest, who is also here with us today. And the materials and travel costs and expenses were paid for by our club. Our club partnered with our sister club of Osaka and obtained a Rotary International Foundation grant to install solar power for the homes. And later, we assisted with funding education providers for the school and for the workshop. Our support also led to the NT government building a new school and teachers' accommodation in Donydji. In terms of the funding, we raised over $1.424 million from philanthropic foundations, which include the John T. Reid Charitable Trusts and Margaret and Ian Ross and Phil Endersby, members of that trust. The Baker Foundation, where Rob Nethercutt, Jerry Johnson and Trevor Nink have been trustees. The Ian Potter Foundation, the Grosvenor Settlement, and the Tyne Reid Charitable Trust. Our club contributed over $180,000 as well. Rotary International Foundation, $50,000 as part of the grant, and the Friends of Donydji, which was a fundraising initiative that we ran to raise money from our club members and other interested parties, raised over $50,000 too. So when we put together the input from the volunteers, it's over $2 million that's been involved and invested in this over the 20 years, which is an incredible achievement. And it proves what is possible, which our club did with the right support and connections, and that's what we're good at. It was also an essential element that this was a long-term commitment to support Neville and the community. It's not something you can just do for a year and walk away from. And what is very interesting about the project is that the key basis of it was, and I'll quote here from the 2014 report by John Mitchell, that to achieve anything with the Aboriginal people, we must listen carefully to their voices and not impose policies or projects that they do not understand and that are so often contrary to their culture. So just think about that and how prescient this statement was in 2014, in light of the request from our Indigenous people and the statement from the heart in 2017 to have a voice or a say in what affects them. And we'll all have the opportunity to get a chance to decide this question in the upcoming referendum. So surely the time has come. The club also provided $30,000 to establish the digitisation of Neville's records, which included his notes, incredible diary notes he took, photos and videos, which are now stored in the Victorian State Library. We then raised additional funds, which included major support from the Baker Foundation and club members, including Peter Duncan and Quinn Scalzo, to enable the production of the Homeland story. So see the film and read the book, and you'll have a unique insight into Neville's amazing commitment to the Donydji community and their lives and the issues they face in living in our Western society. You will then be better informed of some of the unique challenges that Australia faces in providing them with a standard of living that all Australians should have the opportunity to enjoy. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Peter Berg, and thank you, Rob, for that was a great presentation and summary of what's been involved in the club and over the years in this wonderful initiative. With the topic today, it's good that Rob from the club's Indigenous Programs Committee and myself representing colleagues from the Arts Committee have a role in the proceedings. And Rotary Melbourne members and guests, we're privileged to have Don Watson, one of Australia's leading writers, speak to us today on his acclaimed book, The Passion of Private White, which is about the vital role that Dr. Neville White and the Vietnam veterans have played over many years in caring for the welfare of the Donydji clans at Donydji in northeast Arnhem Land, striving to make a successful homeland. And Rob has spoken just how close to the hearts of many past and present club members this story is. Don Watson's books have been bestsellers that include Recollections of a Bleeding Heart, Watson's Dictionary of Weasel Words, American Journeys, The Bush and Watsonia, a collection of vast writings. Over the past 40 years, his essays, articles and reviews on politics, history and culture have appeared in most Australian journals and newspapers, which includes regular writing for the monthly. Don has won numerous awards, which includes the National Biography Award, the Alfred Deakin Essay Prize, the Australian Literary Studies Association Book of the Year, the New South Wales Premier's Award, the Queensland Literary Award and the Age Book of the Year twice. On The Passion of Private White, Tom Griffiths wrote in the Australian Book Review, "No publisher or literary agent could have dreamt up or commissioned this remarkable book. It is wholly unexpected and original." So welcome, Don, to the Rotary Club of Melbourne, and over to you to talk on The Passion of Private White. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter, and that's the wrong thing. The last Rotary Club I addressed was in Zanesville, Ohio, a place you may not have heard of. But I could say that the sentiments expressed here today would not have gone down that well in Zanesville, Ohio. The Tea Party was sort of marching outside at the time, just getting there, with signs saying, "Honk if you love freedom." What that means, I don't know. I mean, you can imagine people who didn't honk didn't love freedom, so it's but that's the way they do things. I want to thank Rotary, particularly on behalf of Neville, who chose not to come because he thought it had put me off. I rather think it was because he thought I would put him off. But he'll be waiting outside somewhere for this to be over. And on his behalf and my own, let me thank Rotary for everything they did for Donydji. I thought I'd acknowledged it well enough in the book, but I realised since that I haven't. It'll be done in the paperback, I promise. This is, the book's really many stories making up an unlikely story. It's the story of Neville in Vietnam and the people he fought with in Vietnam, and of the patriarchy that sent him there, including the old warrior patriarchy, the RSL in those days, a powerful force that sent these young men to Vietnam. It may be partly a form of redemption for me, because my birthday wasn't pulled out of the barrel, and Neville's was. I missed out by a day. Somehow that seems unfair. It's also about colonialism, colonialism in Vietnam, French colonialism, and later American, that led to that war. And it's this series of the colonialism in the Northern Territory, which is preceded in a sort of salutary way by the Macassans, the people from Sulawesi and various parts of Southeast Asia, who came for 200 years, possibly 300, but took nothing. Unlike the British, who came and took everything. The Macassans had they came to trade. Then there were a few skirmishes and a bit of violence, but generally it was a sort of mutually respectful relationship. The British had a different view of colonialism. That was, the land is ours, basically. So the story becomes one of the cattle stations and the frontier war that followed. Like that old lady Reagan was saying, as she said, they came basically to murder us. And these two clans at Donydji were two who never gave up the fight. In the frontier wars, the women and children went into the Mitchell Ranges and held out there while the men fought on the ground down on the flats. It's that story. It's the story of the missions that came subsequently, for better and for worse. Some would say mainly for worse. I'm not so sure. I think they got better as they went on. And it's the story, of course, of the anthropologists who came after all of them. And again, for better and for worse. But generally, I think in Neville's generation of anthropologists and in Donald Thompson before him, it was very much for the better. It's anthropology that leads Neville to Donydji. I should say I met Neville in 1968, in March 1968. He'd come back from Vietnam in December. He'd left his platoon. Some of the members of the platoon were still there fighting in the Tet Offensive when he turned up at Latrobe. And I think he brought with him God knows how many scars and anxieties from that. He read in the paper in 1 column inch that 2 members of his platoon had been killed in February, and as he said later, 1 column inch for all that we were told that we were doing didn't seem quite enough. And I got to know him very quickly, and we've remained friends now for the unlikely time of 55 years. And I started going up there in around 2005 and went up for half a dozen times, more, I think. Anyway, the book was sort of written in the hope that all these different stories could be somehow strung together. And it's up to you to decide whether that I succeeded or not, I suppose. It's a, I know I haven't got a lot of time today, so I'm desperate not to go down rabbit holes. It might be worth asking, this is the sort of first point. Well, no, let's put it this way. The 2 clans at Donydji, the Ratangu and the Wagalak, had been really for at least 5,000 years, not 60,000. It seems almost certain that they came much later than the original inhabitants of Northeast Arnhem Land. But they'd been there for a very, very long time, about the same time as the Minoans, who didn't last anywhere near as long. But you sort of have to think of what colonialism means, what this invasion means to them. Fundamentally, it means that they are cut off from both their material and spiritual life. That the material life is certainly going to change if your land is taken from you or miners are marauding over it all the time. Your spiritual life, it means that you're going to be, that you're cut off from the supernatural, if you like. You're cut off from the way the past speaks to you. You're cut off from your own story. What Neville did when he went there, after years of studying them in the manner of an anthropologist, as a participant observer, that is, within the society but taking no part in activities, just observing and noting things down in hundreds of notebooks, taking thousands and thousands of photographs. His effort became really one of keeping that spiritual life alive, which they wanted, and recording it because they knew it was going to fade out. There were other anthropologists doing the same thing at the same time as Neville. I'm a fan of these anthropologists, actually. I think they were a heroic generation who went into all sorts of places and without whom we would know very much less than we presently know about the way Aboriginal society worked. And its profound complexities and fragilities. So Neville's role really became, it was a sort of deal that he would record the culture, the traditions, the ceremonies, the songs. He would get it all down and they would give it to him. That was their side of the deal. They would tell him all the things he wanted to know, and he in return would help them deal with European society, which they had to do now that they'd become a sedentary homeland at Donydji. I don't know how much you know about Donydji, but it was really just some rocks which BHP in their folly drilled into. They'd already put a landing strip there for their planes. So the two clans decided that they would stay there, form a homeland and protect these sacred rocks. It sits out on the savannah. It's about as isolated as you can possibly imagine. It's an hour and a half to the nearest hub town, a sad place called Gupwiak, and 4 hours to Northern. And when I first went there, it was an extraordinary sight to see these houses going up. At first, it looked like a cult or something was going on there, because out in this empty savannah, there was all this building activity going on. Anyway, and this is where I met the vets for the first time, one of whom is here today. I spoke in Brisbane a few months back, and there were half a dozen of them there. I guess the point is that, so the tension in the story, if you like, is how can Neville keep his side of the bargain? How can he find a way to bridge the virtually unbridgeable? How can they live, these hunter-gatherers whose entire culture is built around the business of hunting and gathering and this intimate knowledge of the land, how can they lead a sedentary life, sing the songs which are about this intimate knowledge of the land, conduct the ceremonies built on the same material culture, when the material culture has changed profoundly? The women go on gathering, but the hunting becomes less and less, and it's done in different ways, so they don't know the land anywhere near as well. How do you put the two things together? How do you... someone said to me in Canberra recently, we get it all wrong because we think it can be done with a solution. There is a solution to this. There's not. He was an anthropologist who preceded Neville up near the Arafura swamp. He says, really, it will take generations. You can't fix it. I think actually the best thing we could do is stop thinking there is a solution. We certainly shouldn't think of the voice as a solution. It's a step, but it's not a solution. Nevertheless, I met someone in Nhulunbuy who said she was a solutions broker. I don't know what solution she was brokering, but it wasn't any good to anybody. So, and I think this was the key to what Neville was doing and what Rotary did in helping him do it. That is to see the business as one of caring, common sense enterprises, listening to what people needed, working it out for yourself, doing the stuff that needed doing. And the moment you start thinking of it that way, so what they were doing, they were building decent houses that was appropriate to the place. They were doing sanitation. They were building workshops for young men to learn trades in. They were building a school for all the kids to learn something. All these practical steps. And what became clear once you saw that as the ideal, then you saw how much we failed them, how much bureaucracy fails them, how much government policy fails them, because they don't do those things. The people who are actually there on the ground turn up unexpected, uninvited. Most of us, in the interest of common sense and caring, would ring before we go somewhere to see if it's an isolated place, to see if I can bring something. They never did. They'd fly in at great expense, fly out again. So the school that was built by Rotary and the vets, a teacher was employed, and after 5 or 6 years it suddenly became obvious that not much teaching was going on, and kids who'd been graded to have reached national benchmarks were still innumerate and illiterate. If you don't actually do the work, it just doesn't get done by magic. So the workshop, this brilliant workshop that was built by the vets, because the greatest problem in these homelands is what happens to the young men who are no longer warriors or hunters but are feeling purposeless. And they're the ones who end up in the hub towns and the ones who really are at gravest risk. The workshop was built expressly for this. There was a trade teacher there for 6 months, and never did the department give them a trade teacher again. So this is the sort of stuff that once you start thinking of the place that needs constant, sensible care and attention, you begin to realise how little of that comes from government sources. In some ways, the missions knew more about it than government has been able to provide. Now, I think that is to Neville's huge credit that he has stayed year after year after year after year, and you can't sit down to have a coffee with Neville without the phone ringing and someone from Donydji on the other end every day, many times a day. When he's not there, and when he is there, he never stops. So that's really the tale. The other thing I think about the book and the film Homeland gets to some of it is just the wonder of these people. Within 3 hours flying time, there are people who live in another cosmos, whose beliefs and culture are just profoundly different to our own. And we know very, very little about them. It's a curious thing, you know, when Henry Reynolds, and good on him, and many other revisionist historians in the 1980s wrote about the other side of the frontier, so-called, they didn't really write about the other side of the frontier. They wrote about the frontier. The other side is what the anthropologists did. The other side you could sort of see at Donydji from time to time. It is something to wonder at, and I think the vast majority of Australians know absolutely nothing about it. One of the ambitions of the book was to sort of create some interest in this, I suppose. There's one other thing, I can see Peter sort of moving, and I'm feeling my time is running out. I have no sense of time at all. A few more minutes. The other thing I sort of want to say is, while it's true that governments and bureaucracies and various other agencies have let people down at Donydji and other places throughout Australia. I agree with Peter Sutton that lots of, in many cases, well, let's put it this way, not everything can be attributed to colonialism. In one sense, it can be. This wouldn't have happened had not Europeans invaded their place and simply walked all over them. It's also true that contemporary problems often stem from characteristics of indigenous culture. And it's really silly to pretend that this isn't the case. The point is to try and understand them, but they have to be addressed. If we're talking about truth-telling, I suppose my point is you've got to tell the whole truth. And you have to understand why many of the things that make life difficult, make it hard to create a Donydji that functions as beautifully as we would hope, or a hub town to function better than it does. You need to tell the whole truth and look at it honestly. I don't think that always happens, but it certainly should. There's a lot of writing and talking about things that we hope would happen rather than things that have happened or are likely to happen. Part of the difficulty of writing this book was trying to get that balance right. There's one character in it that I think sort of sums up the whole problem. His clan name was Nyambut. He was known as Ricky. He was a marvellous young man. He wanted more than anything in life to be a mechanic. He wanted also to keep his traditional life alive. But Ricky was let down by both sides in the end when the authorities at least couldn't find a way to provide a teacher for the workshop that had been built, and when his own clan life prevented him from becoming the community leader he should have been. And Ricky now spends most of his time in the long grass in Katherine, completely defeated. And it's the most tragic personal story I know. And somehow it sort of says something, because I got to know Ricky very well. I think next time I see someone in Darwin or Katherine or anywhere in an appalling state, I'll think of Ricky, frankly. That most of these people have stories like this, and they're stories of really our failure. Really a terrible systemic failure, but they're also very personal stories, and Ricky is one of them. Now, I've left out an awful lot of stuff. I can still see Peter sort of moving, and I'm conscious of needing to. I'll take questions if people want to, yeah.
Thank you, John. That was
Thank you. All right. Oh, is that right? Yeah. Right. Oh, thank you. Which I'd like to hear.
Today. I really don't have a question except to say that I think with homeland story, and that's great that people can see the difficulty of dealing with the situation. And I've always said, as a result of going to Donydji and seeing the wonderful children and their clean teeth and their skin being beautiful, there was a society that was working really well for a period. And you, Stanley, talked about Ricky and the demise to some extent. The question, I suppose, is there any way we can win this war, so to speak, to do it? I believe that this was the seminal example, from my point of view, of the success at a micro level, and I don't believe that we can solve the whole thing at a macro level.
No.
Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I do. And I think the problem is that what works at Donydji might not necessarily work in another Yolngu community. And what works in other Yolngu communities might not work in the Kimberley or the Cape or any of those remote communities. What we do know is that hub towns don't work. Homelands often don't work, but hub towns are grim, awful places where you have the remnants of 18 or 20 clans in Gapawiak, and it's a depressing place to be, where there's nothing to do. When the intervention arrived, Neville and I drove in, and they had 3 people in overalls painting rocks white. That was the work that they could find for them. They faded. Next time we went, the rocks had faded. I don't know if they got anyone to paint them back, but it was farcical. I do think I increasingly think that the Donydji model, generally speaking, is probably the best one, because it took a practical, step-by-step approach. And you have to accept that there are going to be failures and frustrations, and the tools are going to go missing from the workshop, and God Almighty, you don't like to think about it. But you just push on, which is what Neville did, despite all his doubts and at times really serious, miserable doubts. And the place is there, and I mean, there are still kids at the school, there are still there are people who'll go on living there, and it will always be, at the very worst, it'll be a refuge. But who knows? In 20 years' time, it may have picked up and become the model we always hoped it would be. But it's a very, I don't know whether we're going to get any more, whether we can take another dozen or so vets to one of these places, but they were, that was an extraordinary combination of impulses, never to be repeated, I'm sure. Yeah. All right. There are a lot of typos in it. I don't know. Yeah, that's true. I mean, Neville worked on a genealogy for years and years and years, and it does exist. I don't know whether I can get it onto 2 pages, that's all. It's, but it is complicated.
How do we compare with Canada and the United States in the way that we've treated our original inhabitants?
I don't think we've done worse than the US did. Canada seems to make some progress occasionally, but the story is always one of violence followed by neglect at best, and misguided, rather cynical policies very often. I think it's probably not. I think probably New Zealand has done better than any of those examples, but there are different circumstances there. They got a treaty straight off for a start, mainly because they organised their warfare along different grounds, on different lines. It was very hard in Australia to figure out who was who in this vast continent of hundreds of clans and hundreds of languages. But as I said, I think the thing is not to imagine there are solutions. There's one other thing I think, and that is, this is the other lesson of Neville's experience, I think, is that you need to stay. The poor, they're always being left. Someone's always driving up in a brand new spanking 4-wheel drive and then driving away maybe a month later or a fortnight later, and they never see them again. It really requires people to stick with it. And form relationships with generations, But an awful lot of white fellas go up there and are made skin brothers, which is a smart move by the Yolngu because it gives them certain responsibilities. And sort of come away with the sort of hubris of I'm a skin brother of such and such a clan and I've done my bit, but it's really not enough. You know, it'd be better you didn't go in the first place, probably.
Thank you, Don. That was a great presentation.
Thank you.
Right. Great presentation, and thank you for answering those questions. It has given us a great insight and background into the passion of Private White. And look, I'd like to say something on a personal level too, as I basically really sort of support endorsement of what Rob has said about the book, Don. I loved it. I think it's a fabulous, fabulous book. The quality of the writing, the depth of the research involved, it's incredible, Don, how much information and knowledge you've passed on about this very intricate and complex subject, and the way you then wove it in the history, the culture, what was going on, many, many years ago, and the developments, how we got to where we're at, and then interweaving that with the story of Neville and the Vietnam vets is beautifully done, and it's involved so much rich material and background. The importance of land comes through with a sense of place and connection, and it resonates really powerfully right now with the issue of the voice to Parliament. So in thanking you, Don, we've got a gift, and we'd like to present to you with a token gift of socks, which are special socks from the 2023 limited edition Rotary Convention socks, 200,000 Australian made in Preston by our very own past President Phil Endesby's Wilderness Wear, and Phil is sitting down there too, so it's great. And I omitted to give you a round of applause too. I'm sorry about that. So we hope to see you there at the next evening meeting next week, and please stand to close the meeting.